There are houses that feel empty when you enter them. And then there are houses that feel like they were waiting for you. Willowmere was the second kind. I didn't think much of it when I first climbed into the attic. Just dust, old wood, the usual remnants of life long past. But in the corner, beneath lavender-stained linen and silence that felt too deliberate to be natural, I found a box, silver and black, beautifully kept, impossible to ignore. And on top of it, a ballerina, frozen mid-step, watching, the key already inside. I only meant to turn it once. Welcome to Ethereal Echoes. Tonight's story begins in silence, the kind that doesn't feel empty, but waiting. A forgotten house, an attic that remembers more than it should, and a music box that was never meant to be open. 3 notes up, 3 notes down, and something inside the rhythm that begins to listen back. Settle in, dim the lights, and whatever you do, don't turn the key. I stood alone in the attic as dust motes floated through slanting beams of silvery moonlight. The air held the peculiar scent of dried lavender bundles hanging from the rafters, mingling with earthier notes of aged wood and forgotten things. Time felt different up here, stretched thin like silk across the warped floorboards, where rectangular patches of moonlight formed a broken path toward the far corner, illuminating what I had come to find. The loose board beneath my right foot creaked its protest, a sound that seemed to linger longer than it should have in my stillness. My breath made small clouds in the chill air, unusual for early September. But the attic had its own climate, its own rules. Each step I took disturbed decades of settled quiet. My presence an intrusion in space that had grown accustomed to solitude. Grandfather's house had many secrets, most of them mundane. Hidden doorways between servants' quarters, concealed storage beneath window seats, letters pressed between the pages of leather-bound volumes never opened. But Aunt Eliza's whispered warning before she passed led me here, to this particular corner, where a trunk of burgundy leather had sat beneath the slope of the roof. "The box sings," she had murmured, fingers clutching mine with surprising strength. 3 notes up, 3 notes down. Don't let it finish the song. I had dismissed her words as the rambling of morphine and approaching death. Now I wondered. The trunk's brass clasps yielded to my touch with unexpected ease. No resistance from the years of disuse. Inside, neatly folded linens emulated the scent of lavender and something else. A hint of winter air, clean and sharp. I lifted each piece carefully, noting the yellow laced edging, the tiny stitches made by hands long stilled. Beneath the final folded sheet, an ivory laced cloth draped over something solid and rectangular. Moonlight pooled around my fingers as I peeled back the covering to reveal the box beneath. Silver and black enamel, catching the light in a way that made the surface appear liquid rather than solid. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Fragile work along the edges, depicting what might have been vines, or perhaps smoke, curling into intricate patterns. And at its center, an inlaid pattern of stars, or possible snowflakes in mother of pearl. Atop the box, fixed to a small pedestal, stood a porcelain ballerina, no taller than my thumb. Her face was featureless, smooth white porcelain with just a suggestion of eyes and lips. Her tutu, once perhaps white, had taken on the color of old teeth, tiny pleats rendered with possible decay. One arm extended above her head, the other outreached, as if reaching for an unseen partner, frozen mid-movement on a mirrored disc. I traced the edge of the box with one finger, feeling a faint vibration, likely my own pulse translated through my fingertip, though it seemed to have a different rhythm than my heartbeat. The box was cool to the touch, but not cold, as though it retained some inner warmth despite the attic's chill. With a strange reluctance I couldn't name, I lifted the lid. Inside, the mechanism lay exposed, tiny brass hearts and silver pins arranged in a pattern that made no sense, but suggested some deliberate design, like a language I almost recognized. They glinted in the moonlight, these metal pieces catching the beam and throwing it back as fractured light against my face, against the ceiling, creating shadows. A brass key protruded from one side of the box, waiting. I knew without being told that it needed to be turned precisely 3 times. Not 2, not 4. Something about the mechanism's arrangement made this clear. Or perhaps Aunt Eliza's words had taken root more deeply than I'd realized. I turned the key once. It resisted slightly, then yielded with a click that echoed in the quiet attic like a bone snapping. The sound seemed to bounce from rafter to rafter, returning disordered. The second turn came easier, the click softer, but somehow more intimate, like a secret shared too close to my ear. The third turn was nearly silent, but I felt it through my fingers. The final engagement of gears and pins, the subtle shift of the mechanism prepared itself. Then, waiting, a moment's hesitation in which the box seemed to gather itself before the first note emerged. It began with 3 ascending notes, not simply played, but somehow drawn out of the mechanism, each tone pure and sustained beyond what seemed mechanically possible. Each note hung in the air before the next joined it, creating a chord that vibrated against my skin. 3 notes climbing an invisible staircase, reaching towards something just beyond hearing. The ballerina began to turn, her movement so smooth it appeared she moved of her own volition, rather than mechanical force. Her shadow, cast by moonlight, stretched across the floor and up the slanted wall, growing to impossible proportions. Her arms elongating into something less human with each rotation. Then, 3 descending notes followed, falling like water drops into a deep well, each one deeper and somehow darker than the last. The melody was simple, but unsettling, the kind that embeds itself immediately in a memory, that one would find oneself humming without recalling when it was first heard. The ballerina spun, her reflection multiplied infinitely in the mirrored disk beneath her feet. Her shadow continued its strange elongation across the attic floor, trembling slightly with each rotation as though barely contained by the laws of light and form. I remained motionless as the melody repeated, unable or unwilling to move. As the notes surrounded me, my breath synchronized with the rhythm. 3 in, 3 out. The dust motes in the moonlight began to move in patterns that matched the turns of the ballerina, tiny galaxies spinning in silver light. Something within the box mechanism caught. A hesitation, a stutter in the melody, before the final note stretched thin and wavered. The ballerina slowed, made one last half turn, and stopped with her outreached arm pointing directly at me. The silence that followed pressed against my ears like cotton wool. It was not merely the absence of sound, but something active and attentive, a silence that seemed to lean inward, to listen back. I closed the lid. With trembling fingers, my breath loud in the renewed quiet. The moonlit dimmed as clouds passed outside, and for a moment, the attic was plunged into darkness, so complete I could not see my own hand. When light returned, the ballerina remained visible through the box's small glass window, her pose exactly as before. Yet I could have sworn her head was tilted at a slightly different angle. Her featureless face now turned deliberately in my direction. The music box felt heavier in my hands than it had before the melody played, as though the notes themselves had added weight. I wrapped it carefully in the ivory lace, noting how the cloth seemed to cling to the edges of the box like skin, and placed it under my arm. The silence followed me across the attic and down the stairs, a presence at my back that kept perfect time with my footsteps. I descended the narrow attic stairs with the closed box under my arm, its weight shifting slightly against me, though its contents is settled into a new arrangement. The house felt different now. Listening, perhaps. Each step I took echoed differently than it had before, as though the very air had thickened around me. In the dim light of the hallway, I set the music box on the narrow table beneath the age-spotted mirror, adjusting its position until it sat perfectly center, its lid sealed like a whispered secret waiting to be shared. The ivory lace still draped over its silver and black enamel surface, but now It seemed to form a face in its folds, 2 hollow eyes and a stretched mouth, before I smoothed it away with trembling fingers. The box sat innocently enough, silent and still, yet somehow more present than any other object in the house. I found myself reluctant to turn my back on it, taking 3 steps backward before finally turning toward my bedroom. Later, as I prepared for sleep, I noticed my movements had taken on a new deliberation. Each action performed in sets of 3. 3 strokes of the hairbrush, 3 buttons undone, 3 sips of water. The rhythm had worked its way inside of me, and without any awareness or consent. My bedroom had always been my sanctuary, with its faded blue wallpaper and oak furniture worn smooth by generations of hands. Tonight, it felt like a stranger's room, the familiar shapes transformed in the dim light into watchful sentinels. The mirror on my dresser reflected not just my pale face, but also a deeper darkness behind my shoulder that shifted when I didn't. Sleep came with unusual suddenness, not the gradual descent I was accustomed to, but a heavy curtain dropping. One moment I was staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster. The next, I was plunging into blackness so complete it felt like falling. Some intermediate time later, rain began to fall outside, tapping against the window with peculiar precision. 3 measured beats, followed by silence. Then 3 more. In my half-conscious state, I recognized the pattern, but couldn't root myself to full wakefulness. The rain continued its rhythmic conversation with the glass, insistent, yet patient. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap, tap. The sound infiltrated my dreams, structuring them into repeating patterns of 3s. 3 doors I could not open, 3 staircases that led nowhere, 3 faceless figures standing at the foot of my bed. These dream visitors watched me with blank porcelain faces, their arms extended in permanent invitation. Deep inside the darkness of sleep, I became aware of something new. The melody. It seeped beneath my bedroom door like curling smoke, each note perfectly formed despite there being no one to wind the key. 3 ascending notes, 3 descending, over and over. The simple tune somehow more complex in the night, harmonies emerging that hadn't been present in the attic. With the music came footsteps, soft, measured steps that circled the perimeter of my room with careful precision. They matched the tune perfectly, a foot falling on each note with deliberate grace that suggested not walking, but dancing. Around and around they went, never approaching the bed, but never ceasing their circular patrol. I lay paralyzed, my body leaden with sleep, yet mind alert enough to count each step, each note. The footsteps were light, almost delicate, yet they pressed into the floorboards with enough weight to make the old wood creak. Whatever had walked my room had substance, had mass. The melody slowed as dawn approached, the footsteps becoming fainter until they stopped altogether, Somewhere near my dressing table, the final note hung suspended in the gray morning light before dissolving into dust motes that danced in the first ray of sun through my window. I woke fully to find my mouth filled with a metallic taste, as though I'd been sucking on old pennies through the night. My tongue felt coated, and my throat ached with thirst. As I raised my hand to push back the covers, the memory surfaced. A cold fingertip had grazed my hand in the night, tracing a pattern across my knuckles. 3 lines down, 3 lines up. The skin there now felt slightly numb, as though brushed by frost. The house settled into its daytime quiet, creaks and sighs subsiding into ordinary silence. I moved through the morning routine with mechanical efficiency, avoiding the hall table where the music box sat. Yet, I found my eyes drawn to it each time I passed, noting how the light touched its surface differently throughout the day, how shadows pooled around its edges as though reluctant to leave it exposed. That evening, as I sat reading in the library, the grandfather clock in the hall, silent for decades, its mechanism long broken, chimed once. I checked my wristwatch. Exactly 3:03 a.m. Though it had been barely 9 o'clock moments before. The single chime echoed through the house, and when I went to investigate, the clock's pendulum swung once, twice, 3 times before settling back into stillness. The hands remained fixed at the incorrect position. Yet something about their arrangement troubled me. The hour hand at 3, the minute hand at 3, the brass pendulum now pointing straight down like an accusatory finger. I backed away from the clock and collided with the hall table. The music box slid an inch towards the edge, and I caught it reflexively, my fingers wrapping around its cool surface. The porcelain ballerina stared up at me through the small glass window in the lid, her blank face somehow expectant. That night, driven by an impulse I could neither name nor resist, I moved the music box from the hall table to the landing at the top of the stairs. The new location felt right somehow, more central, a place where the melody could reach every corner of the house. I placed it on the small, round table beside the banister, my fingers lingering on its lid before withdrawing. As I walked away, I sensed, rather than smelled, a curious blend of cedar and lilies trailing along the banister, following my hand as it slid down to the polished wood. The scent was faint but distinctive, not unpleasant, yet somehow wrong for this place, this time. A perfume belonging to another era, another person. It clung to my fingertips even after I washed my hands. A ghost of fragrance that returned when I raised my fingers to my face. I slept deeply that night despite my unease, dreaming of dancing through endless rooms where mirrors reflected not my face, but a porcelain mask. The rain returned with its 3-beat rhythm, and somewhere in the house, the melody played again, though fainter now, as if the music box was leaning to modulate its voice. Morning brought no relief. When I passed the landing, I noticed immediately that something had changed. The box's lid was slightly ajar. not enough to activate the mechanism, but enough to reveal a sliver of the mirrored interior. I was certain I had closed it properly the night before, had felt the soft click of the latches engaging. With reluctant fingers, I opened the lid fully, expecting the melody to begin. Silence greeted me instead, yet something was different. The ballerina had shifted positions. Her outreached arm now pointed at a different angle, tilted toward the dark corridor that led to the attic stairs. Her featureless face seemed to regard me with a patient amusement, as though we shared a private joke. I closed the lid with a snap that echoed through the landing. My hand trembled as I withdrew it, and I noticed a small red mark across my index finger. Not quite a cut, but a perfect line as though drawn with red pen. 3 beads of blood welled up along its length, evenly spaced like notes in a measure. I sucked the blood away and tasted metal again, the same taste that had filled my mouth upon waking. My reflection in the hall mirror showed a face grown paler, eyes wider, dark circles beneath them like smudged charcoal. Behind me, though, no one stood there. I glimpsed a flash of white, the suggestion of a tutu, perhaps, or merely a trick of the morning light spilling through the landing window. In the upstairs hallway, I stood before the long, clouded mirror that had hung there since my grandparents' time. Its silver backing had deteriorated around the edges, creating a faint bloom that resembled frost, or perhaps mold. Organic patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Morning light filtered weakly through the lace curtains, casting the hallway in a gray-blue glow that made the worn carpet and faded wallpaper appear submerged underwater in a quiet sea of time. My reflection stared back at me, familiar, yet somehow not entirely my own. The glass distorted subtly, stretching my features just enough to make me look like a close relation rather than myself. The clouding at the mirror's edges had crept further inward overnight. Or perhaps I simply hadn't noticed its extent before. Silver trendles reached towards the center like curious fingers, testing the limits of their domain. I raised my hairbrush, an old silver-backed thing that had belonged to my grandmother, its bristles worn soft with decades of use. Without conscious decision, I found myself brushing in slow, measured strokes that matched the rhythm of the music box's melody. 3 strokes down, pause. 3 strokes up, though the box itself sat downstairs on the landing, silent with its lid closed. The tune played clearly in my mind, structuring movements in inexecutive patterns. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. The repetition was soothing, almost hypnotic. I counted under my breath as I brushed, watching my lips move in the mirror, forming numbers that seemed to hang in the air before dissolving. 21 strokes, then 42, then 63, always in multiples of 3, though I hadn't intended to count at all. On the 72nd stroke, something changed. My reflection continued the downward stroke of the brush, while my own hand had already begun to lift. just a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible lag, but unmistakable. I froze, brush suspended in midair, and my reflection paused a heartbeat later, our movements no longer synchronized. I blinked, but my reflection didn't. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, a movement of quiet study, as though I was the reflection and it was the observer. Its eyes held mine with an intensity that didn't belong to me, a focused curiosity I recognized as foreign. My hand trembled, lowering the brush slowly to my side. The reflection matched the movement, but its fingers splayed differently around the handle, more elegant, more deliberate. Behind that image, in the depths of the mirror where only the hallway should have been reflected, a darker shape began to form. It started as nothing more than a thickening of shadow, a density to the air that suggested presence rather than form. It gathered itself from the corners of the mirror's view, pulling substance from the bloom of silver decay at the edges, from the dust motes floating in gray light, from the very shadows cast by the hallway furniture. The shape leaned forward, closer to my reflection, still without definite form, but undeniably there, a collection of shadow and lamplight that contained intention. My reflection didn't turn to acknowledge it, though its lips curved into the slightest smile, a secret shared with this presence that I could see, but not understand. As I watched, paralyzed, the dark shape's outline began to overlap with my reflections. They merged at the edges first, shadow bleeding into the silhouette of my shoulders, my hair, the curve of my neck. My reflection's smile deepened as the merger progressed, its eyes growing darker, its posture shifting subtly to accommodate with the other presence. Then, from nowhere and everywhere, the music began. 3 ascending notes, 3 descending, the familiar melody of the music box floating through the hallway, though the box itself remained untouched downstairs. The sound seemed to emulate from the mirror itself, or perhaps from the wall behind it, vibrating through the glass and making the clouded silver shimmer like water disturbed by a stone. I stepped backward, breaking eye contact with my reflection, which seemed to remain in place rather than following my retreat. The brush slipped through my fingers, hitting the carpet with a muffled thud that seemed to echo 3 times. When I glanced down at it, then back to the mirror, my reflection had resumed its normal position, mimicking my movements precisely once more. The dark shape had receded to nothing more than a suggestion of deeper shadow in the hallway behind me. The music faded, note by note, until silence pressed against my ears. I left the brush where it had fallen and backed away from the mirror, unable to tear away my eyes from it until I reached the end of the hall and turned the corner. My heart hammered against my ribs in groups of 3 beats, as though even my own pulse had surrendered to the melody's structure. This couldn't continue. I needed to understand what was happening, needed context for the strange events unfolding around me. The music box hadn't arrived without history. Objects like that carried their stories with them, passed from hand to hand, accumulating significance like dust. I returned to the attic, climbing the narrow stairs with deliberate steps, counting under my breath. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm providing strange comfort in its predictability. The space felt different in daylight, less mysterious perhaps, but somehow more watchful, as though my nocturnal visit had awakened something now that had tracked my movements with a patient interest. The burgundy trunk still stood where I had left it, its lid open like a mouth awaiting words. I knelt beside it and began a more thorough examination of its contents, no longer distracted by the music box that had been its most captivating inhabit. Beneath where the box had rested, I found a false bottom, a panel of wood so perfectly fitted that it had escaped my notice before. My fingers found the nearly invisible seam and lifted. Inside the hidden compartment lay a single item, a leather-bound journal, its morocco cover cracked with age, the pages yellowed and fragile at the edges. A faded ribbon marked a place near the end, and the spine creaked as I opened it, releasing the scent of old paper and something else. That same blend of cedar and lilies I had detected on the landing. The handwriting that filled the pages was precise and slanted. The ink faded from black to sepia. I recognized it immediately as my great-aunt Eliza's script, though earlier entries showed a firmness and control that her later years had lacked. The journal appeared to span decades. The earliest entry dated 1937, when she would have been just 23. I skimmed through the pages, describing ordinary life, gardening notes, records of visitors, observations about the changing seasons, until a particular entry caught my eye, dated November 3rd, 1953. The package arrived today, without sender or explanation. Brown paper wrapped around the wooden crate, my name inscribed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, nestled in straw, the silver and black music box that Edward admired so in Vienna before the war. He never returned from that last mission, yet here sits his coveted treasure, delivered to the home he'd never see again. The mechanism works perfectly. The dancers turn. The melody plays. I've placed it on the mantle, though. Its tune brings more sorrow than joy. The entries that followed chronicled subtle changes. The grandfather clock running backwards for exactly 3 minutes each night. The scent of unfamiliar perfume in empty rooms. Footsteps on the stairs when the house was empty. Eliza's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the pages turned, the neat lines wavering and sometimes trailing off mid-sentence. The final entry, dated precisely 47 years earlier, read, "It wants more than music now. I've hidden it away where perhaps it will sleep. The dancer turns, even when the lid is closed. Last night, I dreamed she stood at the foot of my bed, life-sized and still porcelain, her arm extended towards me. When I woke, my sheets were scattered with rose petals, Though no roses bloom this time of year, I will not find it again. Below this entry, in different handwriting, steadier, more controlled, yet somehow colder, a single line had been added in ink that still looked fresh. It is patient. I closed the journal, my fingers trembling against its worn leather cover. The second handwriting belonged to no one I recognized. Certainly not to Uncle Edward, who had never returned from the war. Yet someone had opened this journal after Eliza had made her final entry, had added those 3 words with absolute certainty. A floorboard creaked behind me, though I was alone in the attic. From downstairs, faintly but discreetly, days blurred into one another like watercolors left in rain. I found myself losing track of time. Minutes stretched into long hours as I sat beside the music box, watching light change across its silver surface. Monday became Thursday without my noticing the days between, marked only by shifting angles of sunlight through windows and the gradual accumulation of dust on surfaces. I no longer bothered to clean. Something in me was slowing to match the deliberate pace of the melody, my internal clock rewinding itself to a different era's understanding of time. Nights lengthened while mornings dragged, dawn arriving with reluctance and dusk falling too eagerly. The quality of light in the house had changed. Everything seen through gauze, colors muted as though a thin film of dust had settled over my vision. I moved through the rooms with increasing languor, my footsteps falling into familiar 3-beat rhythms without conscious thought. My paintbrushes stood idle in the jar beside the easel in the morning room, bristles stiffening from disuse. I had come to the house originally to paint. The autumn light through the old windows, the overgrown gardens with the stone statuaries, half consumed by ivy, the peculiar angles of the roofline against the evening skies. My portfolio remained empty, canvases blank, paints untouched in their tubes. Instead, I spent hours beside the music box, now returned to the hall table where it commanded the central passageway of the house. I would sit on the bottom step of the staircase, watching it, sometimes opening the lid, winding the key to release the melody, other times simply observing it in silent presence. The ballerina remained poised, in prenuptial anticipation, her porcelain form catching light differently throughout the day. Translucent in the morning sun, stark white at noon, and faintly blue in the twilight. The melody had become the structure around which my thoughts organized themselves. I found myself unable to consider any idea that couldn't be divided neatly into groups of 3. My journal entries, when I managed to write them, followed the pattern of the tune. 3 sentences up in tone, 3 sentences down, repeating until the thought was complete or I had lost track of what I meant to say. I hummed the melody in empty rooms, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in my mind, This simple progression of notes had lodged itself into my consciousness, playing continuously like a cognitive background process. I would catch myself swaying slightly while standing still. My body kept time with the music only I could hear. Or so I thought, until I noticed the house humming back. It began subtly, a faint vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet when I walked the hallways, matching the rhythm of my step. Then, the ceiling roses seemed to tremble slightly when I hummed the ascending notes. Dust drifting down in patterns too deliberate for random air currents. The closed doors of empty rooms would emit a soft resonance when I passed, as though someone on the other side had pressed their lips to the wood and was returning my melody. The house was listening, learning, responding. Its aged timber and plaster had absorbed the melody and now produced their own variation, a deeper, more textured rendition that I felt more than heard. At night, laying awake, I could feel the entire structure breathing around me, expanding and contracting in sets of 3. The walls inhaling the silence and exhaling faint music. One dawn, I believe it was dawn, though the light had a quality I'd never seen before, neither gray nor gold, but something in between. Like tarnished silver, I descended the stairs to find pale rose petals strewn across the hall table around the music box. They formed no particular pattern, yet their arrangement suggested deliberate placement rather than random scattering. I stopped 3 steps from the bottom, gripping the banister as a vertigo swept through me. The petals were impossible. No roses bloomed on the property, especially not in October, when the garden had already surrendered to autumn's decay. The nearest florist was in the village, 5 miles away, and I hadn't left the house in what must have been weeks. Approaching cautiously, I examined them without touching. Each petal was perfectly formed, unblemished by insect or disease. Their pale pink color, so delicate it appeared almost white in certain light, deepening to a blush at the edges. They looked freshly plucked, dewy with morning moisture, their scent sharp and sweet in the dusty hallway. Their fragrance grew stronger as I leaned closer, not simply the scent of roses, but something more complex. Roses tangled with cedar, with lily, with something metallic that reminded me of the taste in my mouth upon waking. It was a perfume both alluring and slightly sickening in its intensity. Beautiful, but wrong for this time, this place. I reached out and touched one petal with my fingertip. It felt cool against my skin, its texture more liquid than solid, though it maintained its shape perfectly. When I lifted it, the petal clung to my finger as though reluctant to be separated from its fellows, stretching slightly before releasing with a faint sound like a distant sigh. I gathered them in my palm, 21 petals. I counted automatically, 7 groups of 3. and I felt a curious sensation as they rested against my skin. They seemed to pulse slightly, or perhaps it was my own pulse I felt, synchronized now with some other rhythm that wasn't my heart's natural cadence. Without thinking, driven by an impulse I couldn't name, I pressed one petal to my lips. The taste was not floral as I expected, but mineral, ancient, like water drawn from a deep well where sunlight had never penetrated. It spread across my tongue with alarming speed, a coldness that traveled down my throat and bloomed in my chest, and with it came the memory. Not my memory. I had never stood in that Vienna ballroom with its crystal chandeliers throwing prismatic light across the marble floors. I had never worn white gloves that reached my elbows, or ever felt the weight of pearls against my collarbones. I had never watched as the dark-haired man in military dress moved toward me across the crowded room, his eyes fixed on mine with intensity that made me catch my breath. Yet, I remember it all with perfect clarity. The precise pressure of his hands at my waist as we danced, the scent of his cologne mingling with beeswax candles, the whispered promise against my ear that he would return from the front with a gift that would ensure I would remember him always. The memory carried emotions, not my own, anticipation tinged with dread, love shadowed by premonition, longing stretched across years of waiting. I gasped and spat out the petal, which drifted to the floor with unnatural slowness, turning 3 times in the air before settling on the worn carpet. The memory receded but didn't disappear entirely. Instead, taking up residence in some corner of my mind, alongside my own experiences, as real to me now as anything I had actually ever lived. The remaining petals in my hand had curled inward, forming tiny fists of pink flesh. I dropped them onto the hall table where they had landed with soft, wet sounds, already beginning to darken at the edges as though bruising from my touch. The music box remained silent, but as I stared at it, the ballerina visible through the small glass window seemed to have shifted positions again, her outreached arm now bent slightly at the elbow, her head inclined toward me with what I could only interpret as satisfaction. The silver and black enamel gleamed in the strange dawn light, and for a moment, I thought I saw a reflection in its surface that wasn't mine. A woman in white pearls at her throat, watching me with painted eyes that had waited decades for someone to taste her memories. My dreams had begun to spill over their proper boundaries, leaking into waking hours with increasing persistence. I would find myself standing in rooms with no memory of having walked in there, my hand extended as though reaching for a dance partner who existed only in my sleeping mind. Time skipped forward in strange lurches, the clock showing 3 in the afternoon when moments before it had been morning, though the quality of light through the windows remained unchanged. The borders between sleeping and waking had grown porous, reality seeping through in one direction, dreams in the other, until I could no longer be certain which state I currently occupied. Night brought no relief, only a deepening of this uncertain condition. I lay in bed, watching moonlight create silvery parallelograms across my bedroom floor. their edges sharper than seemed natural. Their movement as the moon traversed the sky more rapid than possible. The rectangles stretched and contracted like living things, reaching towards my bed in silent entry. The melody began as it always did now, without the need for my hand to wind the key. 3 ascending notes, 3 descending, floating through the house from its place on the landing. The music had grown more complex over the days, weeks, months of my stay, developing harmonies and counter melodies that twined around the simple theme like ivory on trellis. Tonight, it seemed to emanate from the very walls of my bedroom, as though the house itself had absorbed the tune and now exhaled it through every crack and seam. The cedar lily scent that I had come to associate with the music box hung thick in the air, no longer merely a hint, but a presence as substantial as smoke. It carried notes I hadn't detected before, something mineral beneath the floral sweetness, something ancient like stone worn by sunlight, or bones washed by the tide. The fragrance formed eddies and currents in the still air, concentrating in corners before flowing across the ceiling in patterns that matched the melody's rhythm. Barefoot, I rose from bed, the floorboards cool beneath my feet, despite the summer heat that had baked the house all day. My nightgown? Had I worn a nightgown to bed? I couldn't recall dressing in the high-necked garment with its mother-of-pearl buttons and lace collar, whispered against my ankles as I moved toward the door, which stood slightly ajar, though I distinctly remember closing it before retiring. The hallway beyond stretched longer than it should have, its proportions subtly altered. Doorways that had been evenly spaced now clustered together in some sections, while standing at impossible distance in others. Moonlight spilled through the windows that hadn't existed in daylight, casting silver shafts across unfamiliar wallpaper patterns with vines that seemed to shift and twist when viewed from the corner of my eye. I drifted along this transformed corridor, my feet making no sound against the runner that muffled my steps. The music pulled me forward, growing stronger as I moved deeper into the house. Each door I passed stood slightly open, inviting glimpses into the room both familiar and strange. My bedroom appearing again, where no such repetition should be possible. A library with shelves extending beyond where walls ought to stand. A nursery filled with toys from another century, dust-covered and patient. The melody wrapped around me like gauze as I descended a staircase I had never noticed before, its treads worn in the center from generations of feet. The banister beneath my trailing hand felt warm, almost vital, as though the wood retained some memory of the tree it had once been. At the bottom, a wide hallway extended toward the back of the house, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my passage, their painted lips curved in secret smiles. At the end of the corridor stood a set of double doors, carved with intricate patterns of stars and vines that matched those on the music box. They stood open, revealing a space beyond that glowed with moonlight. The music swelled as I approached, the scent of cedar and lilies almost overwhelming now, drawing me forward with gentle insistence. I stepped through the threshold into a ballroom I had never seen before, though it clearly belonged to the house. its architecture matching the Greek Revival style of the main structure, its plasterwork consistent with the other formal rooms. Tall windows lined one wall, their curtains drawn back to admit 3 perfect triangles of moonlight that fell across the parquet floor like spotlights awaiting performers. Dust motes drifted through these silver shafts, not floating randomly, but moving in deliberate patterns, circling, spiraling, forming momentary consolations before disappearing and reforming in new arrangements. They resembled dancers seen from a great height, their movements choreographed to match the melody that filled the space. The room itself seemed to breathe with the music's rhythm, the walls expanding slightly on ascending notes, contracting on the descending ones. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, a living space, responding to the melody that had awakened in its decades of slumber. In the center of the floor, where the central beam of moonlight fell most directly, a circular pattern in the parquet floor formed a stage. I moved toward it as though drawn by invisible threads, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor that should have creaked beneath my weight. The air grew thicker as I approached the spotlight of silver, resistant like water, then parting around me with a sigh as I stepped into its circle center. The music swelled again, and I found my arms lifting on their own accord. One extended above my head, the other outreached to the side, mirroring the ballerina's pose atop the music box. The position felt natural, inevitable, as though my body had always known this stance and has been waiting to assume it. At the edges of the room, beyond the reach of moonlight, shadows gathered and deepened, not the ordinary darkness of an until space, but something more substantial, something more purposeful. These shadows had weight, had form that shifted and adjusted as I stood motionless in the silver light. They clustered at the room's perimeter, pressing forward slightly before retreating. Their movements suggested bodies leaning in with interest before drawing back in courtesy or caution. I sensed rather than saw their attention. Dozens of presences, perhaps hundreds, observing from the darkness with the quiet assurance of those who have waited a very long time for something specific to occur. Their patience filled the room like another scent layered atop of the cedar and lilies, neither threatening nor benevolent, but simply certain, as gravity is certain, as time's passage is certain. One shadow, near the doorway, seemed more defined than the others, its outline suggesting a woman in a formal dress, her hair arranged in a style decades out of fashion. Though I could distinguish no features in the deeper darkness, I felt her gaze most directly, felt her assessment and approval as I maintained the ballerina's pose in the moonlight. The music continued its endless loop, and the shadows maintained their vigil. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had become as fluid as the melody, flowing around me rather than carrying me forward. My arms should have tired, my legs grown weak from standing so still. Yet, I felt no discomfort, only a growing sense of rightness, of pieces long separated, now rejoining. In the silver light, my skin had taken on a luminous quality, glowing with a faint pearlescence that didn't seem entirely human. When I finally moved, turning my head to look down at my outstretched hand, the motion occurred with curious deliberation, as though my body had remembered how to perform such basic functions. My fingers appeared longer than before, more tapered, their joints more distinct. The shadow at the room's edge stirred at this movement, drawing slightly closer. The most defined shadow, the woman, raised what might have been a hand in gesture that mirrored my own. And though I still could not see her face, I knew she was smiling. "We've waited," the silence seemed to say, though no actual voice disturbed the music's flow. "We've been patient." I opened my mouth to respond, but what emerged was not words, but notes. 3 ascending, 3 descending, in perfect harmony with the melody that surrounded us. The shadows swayed in response, pleased by this development, their forms becoming slightly more substantial, as though my participation strengthened their connection to this place, this moment. The woman's shadow took 1 step forward, entering the edge of moonlight, which revealed the hem of a white dress, a pair of satin shoes, the suggestion of gloved hands, all rendered in gray, silver tones like an old photograph come partially to life. She extended her hand towards me, not quite entering the circle where I stood, but indicating her desire for me to join her instead. The music built towards some crescendo I had never heard before, new notes emerging from the familiar pattern, the melody evolving into something richer and more complex. The moonlight intensified around me, no longer silver, but white hot, almost blinding in its brightness. The woman's hand remained extended, patient, certain of my eventual acceptance. I took a step toward her, and the floor beneath me sighed like a satisfied lover. Mirrors throughout the house had become windows to a transformation I could no longer deny. Each reflective surface, the tarnished looking glass in the bathroom, the clouded mirror in the upstairs hall, even the polished silver serving tray abandoned in the dining room, showed a figure less substantial than the one I remembered inhabiting. My skin had taken on a porcelain sheen, pale and smooth as fired clay, with a translucent quality in certain light. Dark circles beneath my eyes had deepened to hollows that caught shadows like water in a cup, while my irises had lightened to the color of winter sky just before snow. The woman who stared back at me from these various reflections seemed constructed rather than born, assembled from fine materials by skilled hands rather than formed by nature's random patterns. When I brushed my hair, it fell in perfect waves that held whatever shape I arranged them in, as though lacquered into place. My lips remained bloodless despite how hard I bit them, and cuts on my fingertips, from turning pages too quickly, from catching them on door latches, no longer bled but revealed white depths like carved alabaster. My movements had changed as well, growing measured and deliberate. Where before I might have hurried down a hallway or turned quickly to catch a sound, now each gesture unfolded with choreographed precision. My hands described graceful arches when reaching for objects. My neck turned in a smooth, continuous motion rather than jerky human movement of daily life. I found myself occupying space differently, more aware of the volume my body displaced, more conscious of the shapes my limbs created against backgrounds of walls and windows. The house responded in kind to these alterations. Floorboards that had protested beneath my weight now yielded soft sighs of acceptance. Doors that had stuck in humid weather swung open at my approach, their hinges silent, their wood practically leaning to my touch. The shadows cast by lamps and candles, for I had stopped using the harsh electric lights, stretched to match my stride, extending and contracting to keep perfect time with my passage through the rooms. Even the sound of the house had modulated to accommodate my transformation. Creaks became murmurs. Rattling pipes mellowed to distant humming. The wind's assault on loose shutters gentled to rhythmic tapping. The house was learning a new language, or perhaps remembering an old one. A grammar of movement and sound that matched the 3-beat structure of the music that never entirely ceased, even when the box itself remained closed. I spent my days drifting from room to room, touching objects that had belonged to previous occupants, a silver letter opener, a carved wooden box from calling cards, a painted fan with scenes of shepherds and suitors. Each item seemed to hold some fragment of memory that transferred to my fingertips. Not complete stories, but impressions. A woman laughing behind the fan, a man slicing through an envelope with barely contained anger, a child hiding the wooden box beneath floorboards long since replaced. Nights I spent in the ballroom, standing in the rectangle of moonlight, sometimes moving through simple turns and poses that my body seemed to remember, though I had never learned them. The shadowy figures gathered to watch these rehearsals, their numbers growing night by night, their forms becoming more substantial as my own became less so. One night, the rain that had been a constant companion for weeks suddenly ceased. The silence pressed against the windows like a physical force, expectant and alert. No drops tapped their 3-beat rhythm against the glass. No water gurgled through the downspouts. The world outside had paused, holding its breath for whatever would happen next. I moved through the silent house with new purpose, drawn to the hall table where the music box sat. It felt heavier than before when I lifted it, its weight shifting in my hands as though its contents had rearranged themselves. The ballerina, visible through the small glass window, stared up at me with her featureless face. Her pose an echo of one my own body had been learning night after night in the moonlit ballroom. My feet carried me through the transformed hallways of the house, toward the ballroom, the route now familiar, though it had not existed weeks before. The double doors stood open in welcome, moonlight streaming through the tall windows to illuminate the parquet floor, which gleamed as though freshly polished, though no human had tended to it in decades. The marble mantelpiece across from the window provided the perfect stage for the music box. I placed it carefully on the smooth, white surface, adjusting its position until it aligned precisely with the clouded mirror hanging above. In that mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me, the shadowy audience arriving for the evening's performance, taking their places around the edges of the room with silent anticipation. The woman in white stood nearest, her form more defined than the others, though still rendered in grayscale like a figure from early photography. She nodded once, her movements as deliberate as mine had become, and gestured toward the music box with a gloved hand. I placed my fingers on the small brass key protruding from the side of the box. The metal felt warm, almost alive against my skin, pulsing with the same rhythm as the heart that beats slower in my chest with each passing day. 3 times I would turn it, no more, no less, as had been done since the box first arrived at this house. The first turn met resistance, then yielded with a click that echoed through the ballroom like breaking bone. My heartbeat matched it precisely, a heavy thud against my ribs that seemed to shake dust from the crown molding. The second turn came easier, the mechanism warning to its purpose. Another click, another heartbeat. The shadows around the room's perimeter leaned forward slightly, their attention sharpening. The third turn completed the ritual, the key settling into position with a sound lock engaging. My third heartbeat felt deeper than the others, reverberating through my entire body and into the floor beneath my feet. The lid opened of its own accord, the familiar melody emerging, 3 notes ascending, 3 descending, but fuller now, richer, as though an entire orchestra played with the small confines of the silver and black enamel box. The ballerina began to spin, her movements fluid and continuous, faster than seemed possible for the mechanism that drove her. In the mirror, above the mantel, her reflection grew and expanded, stretching upward until it reached life-size, a white figure spinning in an endless pirouette within the clouded glass. The shadows at the edges of the room began to move in response, swaying with the melody, their forms becoming more substantial with each measure. I stepped back from the mantelpiece and into the center of the floor, where moonlight formed a perfect circle. The music surrounded me, no longer emerging solely from the box, but from the very structure of the house. Notes resonating through floorboards, harmonies vibrating in window glass, counter melodies whispered by the drapes that stirred without wind. The tune folded in on itself, becoming more complex, layers of sound building upon each other in mathematical precision. It became a physical presence in the room, a living pulse that beat at my throat where my own pulse had grown fainter. Behind my eyes, vision had begun to blur at the edges with a white haze like frosted glass. I lifted my arms in the now familiar position, one above my head, one extended outward in internal invitation, and turned once in the moonlight. The movement felt graceful and inevitable, the accumulation of a journey I had begun. The moment I lifted the music box's lid in the attic. My nightgown whispered around my ankles as I turned again, the fabric stiffening slightly, taking on weight and structure until it more closely resembled the ballerina's tutu than modern clothing. The shadows circled the edges of the moonlit stage, moving in perfect synchronization with the melody, their forms taking on greater definition with each turn I completed. The woman in white remained silently apart, observing rather than participating. Her face still obscured, though the rest of her had solidified into something almost, but not quite human. I continued to dance, my movements growing more assured with each turn. Steps I had never learned flowed through my body as though awakened from cellular memory. My feet, now clad in what felt like satin slippers, though I had been barefoot moments before, found their positions without hesitation or error. The melody built towards some conclusion I could now anticipate, the notes climbing towards resolution. As I turned for the final time, facing the mirror above the mantel, I caught sight of my reflection, or what had once been my reflection. A ballerina gazed back at me, her tutu white and perfect, her limbs elongated and graceful, her face a smooth porcelain oval with only the suggestion of features. Behind her, behind me, the audience of shadow had gained color and substance. Men in evening clothes, women in gowns from various eras, all watching with expressions of satisfaction and relief. The woman in white stood closest to my reflection, her hand extended towards the mirror's surface. From this angle, I could finally see her. I could finally see her face clearly. Beautiful, familiar, though I had never seen it before. Her eyes dark and knowing. "Eliza," I whispered. Then no sound emerged from my lips, only a final note of music. She smiled, a private curve of lips that acknowledged what we both now understood. She had hidden the box, but hiding was never the same as banishing. Some things waited patiently for discovery, for the ritual to continue with new participants. My final turn completed the transformation. I felt it happen, the last of my humanity draining away like water through cupped fingers, replaced by something lighter, more enduring. The porcelain shell that had been growing around me for weeks finally sealed itself complete, my interior hollowing to make space for the melody that would now play there internally. In the mirror, the ballerina completed her performance with one arm extended toward the gathered shadows, palm open in invitation. The audience applauded silently, their expressions wrapped with pleasure of witnessing a long-awaited event finally come to pass. The music box on the mantel closed its lid with a decisive click, its purpose fulfilled. The ballerina on top, it had changed positions, now an exact miniature of my reflection in the mirror. One arm extended, not towards an imaginary audience, but toward the corridor beyond the ballroom, where future footsteps would eventually arrive. The woman I now recognized as Aunt Eliza nodded once, satisfaction in her eyes, before she and the other shadows began to fade, their purpose complete. As they dissolved, I understood that I would take their place, watching, waiting, growing stronger until the next curious hand would turn the key 3 times and the cycle would continue. My reflection in the mirror, porcelain and perfect, smiled with patient certainty. Years slipped away like pages torn from a book. Some studied, others torn free so fast their words blurred. I watched from behind every wall and mirror, beneath each floorboard, and through the glass dome shielding the music box on the marble mantel. Time no longer carried me forward. It stalled me, a still pond rippling only when something or someone disturbed its surface. After my transformation, the house stood empty. Dust gathered on sheeted chairs. Spiders wove ghostly tapestries in corners. Ivy crept higher each season, yet I was never alone. Shadows pooled each night in the ballroom, and memories performed their old dramas for me, again and again, as though I were an unseen audience. Then came the new owners, a young academic couple with bright hopes for restoring Willowmere. They breezed in, tossing aside cobwebs, throwing open sealed windows, and talking excitedly about concerts in the ballroom. "The acoustics in here are incredible," the husband said, clapping his hands under the high ceiling. "It's freezing here," his wife shivered, even though it was midsummer. "And look, worn floorboards in a perfect circle." They claimed drafts and creaking timbers for the cold spots and the 3 steps, pause, 3 steps echoing through the night. They blamed drifting scents of cedar and lilies on garden breezes, never guessing those blooms did not grow here. "Old houses breathe," he told her whenever she fretted. "They carry the souls of everyone who's lived in them." He was closer to the truth than he knew. Their first discovery was the music box, still poised beneath its dome where I'd left it. The husband lifted the dome and turned it over in his hands. "Swiss, 19th century," he murmured. "The spring's probably rusted." He replaced it, distracted by contractors. The wife lingered, staring through the little window at the frozen ballerina, her blank face and outstretched arms beckoning. "There's something wrong with her pose," she whispered that night in the former master bedroom. "She's reaching for something she'll never touch." "It's just a trinket," he mumbled, half asleep. "We'll sell it." Yet through all their renovations and redecorating, the box stayed. The key lay untouched, the melody unsung. On moonlit nights, through a faint 3-note tune drifted through the empty halls, a simple ascent and descent that vanished as quickly as it came. The husband blamed drafts in the chimney. The wife, too weary to protest, said nothing. They never noticed that each time the melody sounded, the ballroom chilled by exactly 3 degrees, or that every mirror in the house clouded at its edges like frost. No one saw how the ballerina shifted with each moon phase, a tilt of her porcelain head, a small turn of her arm. The changes were almost imperceptible, just enough to suggest she was alive. Years passed, the couple aged. They hosted dinner parties, watched grandchildren race the halls, whispered arguments and apologies within walls that swallowed every sound. They grew used to odd things, doors left ajar, a feeling of unseen eyes on the staircase, dreams of dancing partners they could not see. The wife paused before the cloudy hallway mirror, staring as if she saw someone else behind her. The husband hummed that 3-note tune while poring over books in his study. Visitors felt Willowmere's pull. Children pointed to the top of the stairs. "Who's that white lady?" They spoke of voices no adult heard. "Just imaginations," the husband laughed too loudly. "Inspiring old house." They avoided the ballroom, where the music box reigned on its marble throne. They never saw the nightly revels, ghost dancers, gliding across the polished floor, led by a white figure in a snow-bright tutu, precise and graceful as she recreated the fateful dance that had trapped her here. I hovered between ghost and guardian, prisoner and keeper. I marked their days like minor verses in the house's grand symphony. Their lives were brief interludes. Mine stretched on without end. I had forsaken flesh for cold porcelain, eternity for continuance. Sometimes, when moonlight struck a mirror just so, the ballerina's hand in the reflection lifted an invitation, fingers curved as though to beckon. Anyone watching might have raised their own hand, drawn by invisible strings. The box stayed quiet, but inside, gears uncoiled themselves. Brass hearts and silver pins rotated in perfect rhythm, powered by something that was no longer clockwork. Willowmere would outlast these owners too. It would swallow their stories, absorb their dramas, preserve its secret until someone, curious, unwitting, turned the key at last. 3 notes up, invitation. 3 notes down, surrender. Silence. Transformation. One night, the wife crept into the ballroom, drawn by the faint, familiar tune. The house sighed with delight as she approached the mantel. Her fingertips, pale and trembling, reached for the key. The spring unlatched with metallic sigh. In the hush that followed, she heard it, a single, perfect note, ringing through the still air, and then another, and another. She tried to pull back, but the melody had already woven its spell around her heart. Behind her, the mirror fogged. From the glass emerged her reflection, wider-eyed, still, porcelain-skinned, smiling and raising a hand in silent welcome. At the final descending note, she stepped forward. The music box fell silent as her pulse stilled. The ballerina's arms closed around a new companion. And Willowmere exhaled, content once more, forever patient, forever waiting for the next curious hand to turn the key. And somewhere within Willowmere, the music still lingers, waiting, listening. But for now, the house is quiet. The melody has settled, and whatever turned within those walls has grown still. If you felt it, if something in this story stayed with you, subscribe and return again. Let the story fade, let the silence return, and rest. Good night.